I personally am expecting quite a lot of activity around Venezuela and also around Iran, because neither of those conflicts show any sign of dissipating.
We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars we end.
Right now, all eyes are on Washington. But who's actually watching Europe at the moment?
The deepening ties between China, Russia and North Korea would certainly have some in Washington concerned.
And then Daddy has to sometimes use strong language.
The IDF will continue to uphold the ceasefire agreement and will respond firmly to any violation of it.
I'm Venetia Rainey, and this is Battle Lines. It's Monday, 15th of December, 2025. Today saw not one, but two landmark speeches from the highest levels of the UK's security forces that should serve as a klaxon for the state of the world. The new chief of MI6, Britain's Foreign Intelligence Service, warned that the front line is now everywhere, and we're facing an age of uncertainty. In her first speech from the MI6 headquarters, Blaise Metrovelli, who, by the way, is the first female chief of MI6, pretty cool, she singled out Russia for the risk it poses. The export of chaos is a feature, not a bug, in the Russian approach to international engagement, and we should be ready for this to continue until Putin is forced to change his calculus. Meanwhile, elsewhere in London, Britain's new Chief of Defence Staff, Air Chief Marshal Sir Richard Knighton, gave a speech at RUSI warning that the price of peace is increasing. He said, "It's about our defence and resilience being a higher national priority for all of us, an all-in mentality, and that will require people who are not soldiers, sailors or aviators to nevertheless invest their skills and money in innovation and problem-solving on the nation's behalf. A new era for defence doesn't just mean our military and government stepping up, as we are, it means our whole nation stepping up." This is fighting talk. The question is, are the government and public listening? Now, if you're not in the UK, you might be thinking, this isn't relevant to me. But this is not just a UK problem. This is a global problem. Our world is shifting in ways that threaten all of us. As a Battle Lines listener, you know this has been a year of conflict, from Ukraine to Gaza to Sudan. But did you know that Europe is now the most intense conflict zone globally? Or that drone strikes now account for more than a quarter of all attacks worldwide? Or that Sudan's Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, is now the world's deadliest non-state armed group. The Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Organisation, known as ACLED for short, thankfully, has been tracking all of this and more. They've just put out their annual report for 2025, and they've also highlighted 10 conflict hotspots to watch in 2026. Spoiler alert, next year is expected to be even bloodier. To dig into the details behind all of this, I caught up with their CEO, Clionadh Raleigh. I started by asking her what the main takeaways were from their research.
We do an index every year that encapsulates how we can understand conflict across 2025 and look into what we might expect to see in 2026. And what we're seeing this year is that we are establishing a new normal for how violent the world is. So in the last 5 years, we've seen conflict rates double. And in fact, in 2024, we noticed an absolute doubling from 2019. This year is almost equal to what we saw in 2024. And that indicates that despite the fact that the actual, let's say, the places or the actual type of conflict may have shifted, the rate of violence is still extremely high. And we expect that to continue. 1 in 6 people are now directly exposed to political violence or conflict in some form, which is very, very serious, very high number. But what I would also say is that if the most violent places tend to be places like Gaza and Ukraine, where you already have a very contained population, as those conflicts become less important and other conflicts that are much more diffuse become more important, we should expect to see more people directly exposed to conflict in 2026.
There's some other sort of aspects of warfare. I know you've also highlighted the 10 conflict hotspots, and it'd be great to run through those. But let's just stick with the sort of broader themes of warfare that you guys have picked out. Drone strikes now define modern warfare. That probably won't be a surprise to any of our listeners. But your stats are quite surprising. Air and drone strikes account for 28% of all conflict events in 2025, more than 51,000 events worldwide. Were you surprised by that? A quarter of all conflict events.
Yeah, it's extremely high. So not only do most conflict events now have some sort of role of the state, which is quite a surprise compared to 5, maybe 10 years ago, where we were talking about non-state armed groups much more than we were talking about state violence. But you know yourself, there's been a drastic increase in defense spending. And when that happens, there often tends to be an associated increase with state violence. And states use bombs and drones and much more technological and sophisticated material in order to conduct warfare. But what we did see last year, which should be a worry, is that now rebel groups, insurgent groups, terrorist groups, militias, they're all starting to use some of this material. And what these things do is that it's targeted, but it's extremely destructive. I mean, of course, burning down a village is also extremely destructive, but you can be removed from the violence through drones and bombing in a way that you can't when you're directly exposing villages and communities.
Let's talk about some of these places then. One of your other headlines is that Europe has overtaken other regions as the world's most intense conflict zone. Is that all because of what's going on in Ukraine?
It's by far one of the most violent places in the world. The features of the Ukrainian war get kind of lost because, to be totally frank, it doesn't change that much. It's just at a perpetually extremely high destructive rate. But while it doesn't move very much and the actors are always the same, the sheer amount of carnage in the Ukrainian conflict is very difficult to explain relative to other conflicts. It's so much higher.
You've ranked Ukraine first for deadliness, citing nearly 70,000 people have been killed in the first 11 months of 2025. Is that a change from last year? And can you talk us through some of the data that's underlying your analysis of that conflict this year?
Over 26,000 battle events were recorded in Ukraine, which is the highest annual total since the full-scale invasion began. It's about 53% increase compared to 2024. And what that is saying to us is effectively that there is an intensification of the kind of combat, if you will, that's happening within that conflict. And of course, the actual number of people who have died within that conflict is an estimate. I really do want to emphasize that because, as with almost all fatality figures, there will be one from the Ukrainians, one from the Russians, one from the Americans, and oftentimes there will be a kind of composite from attempts to do some sort of media reporting. But with those types of increases in battle events, you would, of course, get an increase in the conflict events themselves. But I do want to emphasize that the Ukrainian conflict has a relatively low rate of civilian killing, despite the fact that there were far more attacks in Kyiv and other cities in this last year. And that's because in the very first year of the Ukrainian conflict, the civilian conflict deaths and the civilian attacks were really intensely located in the east of the country. The people have either left or they, in fact, have suffered already, whether it's death or otherwise. So you get a decrease in civilian violence when the conflict doesn't move, but it still remains very entrenched within that place.
And nearly 200 settlements seized by the Russian forces in Ukraine, which you say is just slightly less than the total from the previous 2 years combined. That does suggest that the war is shifting in Russia's favour.
It does. And I know that we hear a lot of contrasting opinions or even contrasting news about this within the media. But Russia has brought in a huge number of, to be honest, mercenaries from other countries to fill its lines. Ukraine doesn't have that type of ability to do so. And indeed, I don't think it does want to do those types of things. But it's resulted in Russia feeling like they're emboldened within that context. And of course, what we've seen is that even their engagement with the US around peace agreements is because they really do feel like they could win this through sheer exhaustion of the Ukrainian forces.
Are there other things happening in Europe that led you to suggest that it's the most intense conflict zone in the world?
There are, of course, increased attacks in Russia, which I do want to mention because the Ukrainians have they've tried to take the fight to Russia as much as possible. So that's also accounting for some of those numbers. But while Ukraine, bizarrely, for many, is not in the top 10 most extremely violent places in our index, it's because the way we've chosen to determine the dimensions of conflict within the world is not simply about the event numbers, for which Ukraine would certainly be much higher than most places. It's both a reflection, I think, of the dimensions of deadliness and danger to civilians, which we've just discussed, but equally fragmentation, how many non-state armed groups are operational within a country, and also how diffuse that conflict is. Now, the Ukrainian conflict is neither diffuse, because they're fighting over every meter, nor is it fragmented. So a country like Myanmar, for example, which is deadly, it's dangerous, it's diffuse, and it's incredibly fragmented, ends up higher on the list than Ukraine does, in part because there's almost no way to end the conflict in Myanmar, because it is so complicated. It's like death by 1,000 cuts.
I think the inclusion of Myanmar right at the top of your list is really interesting, because it is one of those conflicts that everyone who follows world news knows is happening, but it's dropped almost completely out of the headlines. No sense of an ending in sight. Can you tell us a bit more about what ACLED found about the data underlying this conflict?
I do want to emphasize that you might get the same number of events in countries like Mexico, Myanmar, or even in Gaza or Ukraine. You get the same number of events, but the composition of that conflict can be drastically different. And the composition of the conflict in Myanmar is such an interesting and devastating combination of factors, which is that you have over 1,000 armed groups operating. Now, they operate in very small areas, right? So there's a real churn to how those groups operate. The state is trying to take on most, if not all of them, because these non-state armed groups find it almost impossible to coordinate and to aggregate into substantial threats to the government. The government can try all sorts of other ways rather than direct hits in order to get at these groups. So they can kind of starve them of their ability to operate rather than fight them directly. But what it means effectively is that the people of Myanmar are constantly surrounded by both implosion of these groups, but also the recreation of these groups. And no one's representing these people. No one's able to provide security. And in fact, the government is holding on, despite the fact that, as I mentioned before, it's kind of death by 1,000 cuts.
You've got a quite alarming stat. Conscription-related abductions increased by 26% compared to 2024. What does that tell us about how these armed groups are operating on the ground?
We see kidnapping and abduction as a really fundamental part of how many armed groups survive, especially survive difficult times. Kidnapping, of course, has been in the news lately because of what's happening in Nigeria and other spaces. But in Myanmar, and of course, as we were just discussing in Russia, the way in which people can replenish, I mean, as awful as this sounds, kind of the stocks of human life that they hope to then destroy on the battlefield has not really advanced since ancient times. They simply take people and they throw them in front. They're cannon fodder, for lack of a better term. But in those conflicts, what's really disturbing about this is that you have this, very ancient form almost of throwing people in front of bullets, but you also have increased technology. There is almost something both medieval and incredibly sophisticated about how these modern wars are being fought.
One of the things that surprised me was your discussion about how the Islamic State has shifted its operations from the Middle East to Africa. Most people think the Islamic State has kind of gone, or maybe it's got some offshoots left. We've heard about them in Nigeria recently, an offshoot of Islamic State. I don't think most people have a sense of how widespread their operations are actually in Africa. Tell us a bit about what you discovered.
So there are a few really key sites of how the Islamic State have chosen to embed themselves within African states. So, of course, you have what's called ISGS, or used to be called ISGS, which is operating out of Niger and Mali and increasingly Burkina Faso. And so that group often fights the Al-Qaeda affiliate, Jainim, within the Sahel. And they are contesting for control over this area. Their fight used to be very, very intense. But since Jainim is succeeding over the Malian state and increasingly in Burkina Faso, I expect to see more coordination between those armed groups. So you've got Jainim and ISGS who have really taken control of a huge swath of the Sahel. You, of course, have a much smaller group in places like Somalia. But what's key about the Somali group is that although it's fighting with Al-Shabaab, which is another Al-Qaeda affiliate, what the group in Somalia does is pay for or make sure the financial transactions get to the other groups across African states. And you have, of course, ISIS in Mozambique. You also have an ISIS affiliate in Congo. Those two are quite closely related. Those are the main sites. So the Sahel, Somalia, Congo, and Mozambique within that area. Of course, the Nigerian site is very well established. You don't hear about it too much because it really is trying to establish almost a fiefdom of some sort with total control over the very far northeast of the country.
So that's why the Sahel was one of the conflict hotspots that ACLED has highlighted, that risk of the Islamic State encroaching and this ongoing battle with Al-Qaeda and various offshoots.
Yeah, I would say one of the most worrying things that happened over the last few weeks is that we saw a JNIM and an associated Al-Qaeda incursion into Nigeria. Nigeria is really an interesting case because you have so many concurrent overlapping forms of conflict that are occurring there. But generally, you had Boko Haram and ISWAP, the IS affiliate, operational in the northeast, but you didn't see the incursion of the Sahelian forces into Nigeria until relatively recently. Those forces are both moving into Nigeria and they're going south into Benin and Togo, Ghana, etc., which is causing a lot of fear amongst not only those countries, but also the international community about their unchecked diffusion.
Staying with Africa, Sudan is another country that your report sheds a spotlight on. You've singled out the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, which we've heard lots about on this podcast, as the deadliest non-state armed group in the world. You say it's responsible for 11% of all civilian deaths caused by non-state actors. How difficult was the reporting around that?
RSF have really made a name for themselves around doing mass attacks. The most recent one, of course, you would have heard about within the Darfur region. They held El Fasher in a siege for about 500 days before they attacked. And then they were merciless once they actually attacked the town. It is a difficult context to get information from, not just because the people on the ground are incredibly brave in their ability to transmit information out, but that conflict is one where the government, the SAF forces, are well matched with the RSF. In fact, the RSF is in many ways tied to the support of UAE, which I'll mention in just a second. But what both SAF and the RSF try to do is to encourage alliances, very local alliances across the areas in which they're operational in order to bolster their control and authority of these places. But that also comes with a change of authority and typically a very high rate of associated violence against civilians as people try to contest the authority of these new groups. The story of Sudan is not just these huge attacks in El Fasher and other places, but also the little constant attacks that happen in the towns that people are left in and find impossible to leave because of the ways in which the geography of that conflict has developed.
And again, that's another conflict where drones are really exacerbating the toll on civilians. 47% more drone strikes than in the first 11 months of 2024. Where are these drones coming from?
So in both cases, both SAF and the RSF, what I would say is that there's a sense that this conflict will not end without a really big surge of investment into one or both of those groups by different parties. The RSF is believed to be entirely, let's say, trained and funded by UAE and UAE affiliated entities, while SAF is trying to retain some sort of, I would say, international legitimacy in how it goes about its business. So, of course, Egypt, Turkey, other countries, especially neighboring countries, are trying to make sure that the RSF does not actually take over. But what I would say is that 4 countries seem to be having an outsized role in conflict more broadly, directly and indirectly. And that is Israel, Russia, UAE, and the United States. So what seems to be happening here is that each of those countries recognizes that the world geopolitical map is changing, and they can have a very strong role in what it looks like next year and in 5 years and in 10 years. And they're building alliances with some untraditional and some strange bedfellows, let's just say. But they're also going after what they would consider to be enemies and threats that we might not have recognized as such relatively recently. And so, Russia and UAE are especially taking an interest within African states. So, for example, the UAE is supplying the RSF through Central African Republic, which Russia has spent quite a long time cultivating, as has the UAE. So what we should expect to see is that groups that don't seem to have either local legitimacy or a political plan for the, let's say, the peaceful continuation of power within a country still manage to perpetuate their violence because of associations with one of these groups.
We're going to take a short break now. Coming up afterwards, the war is over in Syria, so why has violence gone up? Welcome back. Before we continue with the episode, I want to ask you a quick favour. If you're enjoying this show, please leave us a review wherever you're listening to this. It really helps us figure out what you like and what you don't. Thanks in advance. Now, back to the conversation with ACLED CEO Clionadh Raleigh. Let's move to the Middle East. Obviously, a year of a lot of hot conflict, the war in Gaza, Israel's bombing campaign against Iran, background violence in Lebanon, in Syria. You've said that violence has declined by 48% in the region. That sounds like a great headline stat, but that the stability continues. And you've actually described Israel and Russia jointly as accounting for nearly 90% of all civilian targeting incidents abroad, making their wars, you describe it as the principal drivers of modern transnational violence. Basically, their wars against other actors were the deadliest wars in the world in 2025. What can you tell us about the data that you managed to gather around the Gaza war? Let's start there.
Sure. So the situation, of course, in Gaza has decreased, or rather the intensity of the situation has decreased following the ceasefire. Again, this is a case where the numbers of people who have died in Gaza is very contested, although it's extremely high. In some ways, the overall number is less contested than the composition of the victims. Israel, of course, would say that they were combatants, whereas both Hamas, the Ministry of Health, and I think any operational NGOs on the ground will point to the overwhelming civilian loss of life within that conflict. There has been, in the Gaza situation, not a decrease in the amount of information coming out of Gaza. There's still a tremendous amount of information about the strikes, of course, who's hit, and the follow-on strikes by the IDF. There's a contestation about the story rather than the actual numbers or the events themselves. While it has not been difficult to ascertain the lie of the land, although I will say that post-ceasefire, it's been quite a struggle to make sure that we get the correct information about how Hamas is choosing to reinforce its own control and security on the ground, because that is a contest with several groups that are operational there. The actual information itself in terms of the struggle with Israel has been well documented.
The Palestinian occupied territories hold your number one spot on ACLED's conflict index. You say it's the third deadliest country after Ukraine and Sudan, with just over 16,000 fatalities recorded this year. You mentioned the fact that the numbers are contested in terms of how they break down between combatants and civilians. Did you manage to get to the bottom of that? What's ACLED's view on that ratio?
Well, we effectively take the opinion that Hamas is certainly nowhere near the size that Israel would need it to be in order for those numbers to look anything other than civilian deaths. And of course, the breakdown of both women and children who have been affected, that is coming from the Ministry of Health, has been reinforced by other independent and unbiased sources. And so I think that the numbers, while extremely high and very, very jarring, are generally correct from the Ministry of Health.
You also spotlight the rise in violence in the West Bank. Israeli military activity increased by 78% compared to 2024. I think that stat might be surprising to some people. We hear a lot about settler violence in the West Bank, but perhaps slightly less about IDF activity. Were you looking at both aspects, or were you just focusing on the Israeli military?
We look at all groups within the spectrum of conflict we collect. It's very important to also note that in the West Bank more generally, you have a more diverse form of conflict actors on the Palestinian side. There are a number of other militias in addition to Hamas that are operational that cause quite a lot of violence within that context. But the vast majority of violence occurring, especially in the settlement areas of the West Bank, are both prompted and promoted by settlers, but certainly not stopped by the IDF. That's a huge problem there, which is that the security of the West Bank does not seem to extend to its Palestinian residents. It seems to, in fact, be against those residents.
One of the other countries that underlies the sort of top line drop in violence in the region by 48% that I mentioned earlier is the end of Syria's civil war, which is good news. And I'm speaking to you on the anniversary of the ouster of Bashar al-Assad this time last year. But you still spotlight Syria as one of the conflict hotspots to watch. Why is that?
So there's a number of problems within Syria that are not going to be rectified with a change in national government. And of course, if anything, it's been exacerbated. This competition for power locally is exacerbated by what might be seen as a drastic and, of course, welcome change at the helm. I was just at the Doha Forum and al-Sharia spoke And he acknowledged, of course, that there's tremendous sectarian violence that is happening within the country, but he wanted to underline something that I thought was very interesting and that would likely be used by many, let's just call them non-traditional new leaders within the region, which was that he's being held to a standard around the security of his country that no other leader is being held to, and that he is uniquely unable to deliver in the first year of this transition, which was that there would be an entirely peaceful transition of power. There has been a tremendous decrease in the violence within Syria. There's no question about that, which is not to say that certain communities are not going to be overly affected, especially Alawite communities and Druze communities that are, their struggles are not about national levels of power. They're about quite local and regional levels of authority and competition for it. I do think that he gave a very compelling explanation for why and how he thinks there will be a transition in Syria that will be more inclusive, but will not likely be nonviolent in every way, in part because we see almost no political transition in any parts of the world being nonviolent.
The data is quite surprising that conflict-related deaths in Syria have risen from just over 6,000 in 2024 to over 9,000 this year. Tell us a bit more about what's driving that. You mentioned some sectarian violence. Is it all that?
You may know, and is in the report, we recorded 40% fewer violent events in the first 11 months compared to the first 11 months of 2024. Yet the incidents have become 3 times deadlier because high-impact attacks were concentrated in regions of minority communities. And in fact, 70% of all reported fatalities occurred in just 5 provinces. So, for example, Aleppo, Tartus, and Hama. But Al-Suwaida and Latakia were where we saw the vast majority of those. Of course, Israel had conducted several attacks in the territory, more so than any other foreign military. So what we're effectively saying is that almost 5,000 civilians were killed in the direct targeting in the region over this period. They are in minority places and already in 5 of those provinces. It is a very difficult transition. It will continue to be. I think there's no question that it will continue to be violent into 2026, but it is far different in its composition. Again, the composition of violence being so important and the numbers, but the composition of violence being one where there needs to be a huge number of local solutions for what happened in Syria, as reflected in the number of groups that used to be active there and obviously have political contestation at the local level, and resolving that being, I would say, the first job of the national government.
Let's move to the other side of the world. Latin America and the Caribbean has also made it onto your 10 hotspots to watch. Is this all to do with Trump's US military buildup?
I would hope that would be the case, because that would also indicate that it could effectively stop with Trump too. But no, Latin America has a tremendous number of domestic problems outside of its now international problems that have come before Trump and that will be there potentially far after Trump. So gangs, cartels, and other non-state armed groups targeted civilians in almost 15,000 violent events. 5,000 people have died as a result of clashes between state forces and armed groups. As we mentioned before, 4 in 10 countries with the most intense political violence are in Latin America and the Caribbean. And what I would really emphasize here is that these are domestic problems more so than anything else. They're linked, certainly. So, for example, there's accusations that one of the reasons that Ecuador now has the second highest murder rate is because Colombia has effectively moved its problems into Ecuadorian territory. But what this tells you is that it's incredibly easy for these groups to embed themselves within these countries, and it's incredibly difficult to get rid of them. So we can look to, for example, El Salvador in Central America, and its extremely hard response to gangs through widespread jailing as one option to get rid of those. But on the other side of the spectrum, we had a Mexican government before the current Sheinbaum government who had a much more pervasive or permissive attitude toward the pervasive cartel violence within that country. Both of those have major flaws, although I would suspect that the Mexican example was far more flawed than the El Salvador response. But what you have in those cases is a proliferation of militias operating often in urban areas, sometimes in coordination with the police and the government and sometimes not. But somebody was telling me a very interesting context within Mexico where you have cartels associated with different scales and regions of the federal government. So you can often have federal troops, state troops, and local troops fighting against each other as they are effectively indirect affiliates of these different cartel members. And so with a context like that, where you have, as I mentioned before, a very low rate of state involvement in their own conflicts, you have ceded all of this territory and all of this control to these contesting groups who have very little interest in either safety or the governance of these countries.
You highlighted Ecuador there, and your report describes it as standing at the epicenter of criminal violence in Latin America. President Daniel Noboa effectively declared an internal armed conflict, a sort of civil war, a war against these gangs. But that approach appears to have completely failed. What does your data show us about how this is impacting the civilian population?
So in Ecuador, of course, you have a situation in which there has been a drastic rise, not just in the overall level of conflict, but there's been a report by the UN indicating that the homicide rates for children and adolescents have actually skyrocketed, something like 600%. And overall, what we have is 70% of the Ecuadorian population is exposed to regular violence. Now, in a context like this, where the government clearly is unable to control or shape the risks that their civilians are facing, or even their own state security, and you get a 70% rate of exposure, there are very few options for Ecuadorians to try to deal with their own risk and the threat to themselves and their families. And so they have to suffer through the most intense uncertainty and pressure and conflict with no end in sight. I think that's perhaps the most worrying thing, is that it doesn't have a political objective that it's seeking to reach, in which case it would then reform, for example, the government. You effectively have an economic motive that has necessitated control of the country itself, which will never, in fact, be achieved to bring security to the population.
One of the countries, we're getting towards the end of your list here, but one of the countries on here surprised me, and that was Pakistan. Your data says it's now 10th on ACLED's conflict index, moved up 2 spaces compared to last year. What's driving the rise in conflict-related violence there?
So there's 3 different things that drive Pakistani violence, and they all kind of came together at the end of this year, and I think that they'll continue into next year. You have the ongoing, of course, tensions with India, which have only gotten worse from a little bit of a lull in the recent years, but they've gotten worse with almost twinned terrorist attacks in the last few weeks. Plus, of course, the sense that the terrorism that's happening within northern India is being fueled by the typical Pakistani elements. You also have new clashes with Afghanistan, especially over the what's called the Pakistani Taliban, etc. And so you have 2 border control clashes, but you also have a wide range of internal clashes. Some highly partisan, of course. Pakistan has extremely hard lines with partisan groups, but you also have regional problems such as Balochistan and others that are kind of constant problems that flare up at different moments. They especially flare up when they feel like the Pakistani military is otherwise busy with either Indian or Afghan problems. So Pakistan is facing conflicts on multiple fronts.
The final place we should talk about on your list is not a country, but a trade artery, the Red Sea. We did hear quite a lot about the Houthis attacking shipping in 2024, but your data shows that there are 84% fewer Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, but you've still identified it as one of the conflict hotspots to watch. Why is that?
I always like to say that the Houthis are living their best life. They get to make so much trouble out of such a small area. And, sometimes, especially, again, kind of Iran's investment in their ability to make trouble was really heightened, especially earlier this year, with quite a number of the attacks that they had placed upon international shipping lanes. They did, in fact, receive quite a lot of blowback for that, whether it's US strikes, of course, Israeli strikes, and also the fact that when they go into these peace negotiations for their myriad of domestic problems, their acquiescence, I suppose, to the international pressure around shipping lanes certainly helped them out. They have some big problems brewing, though, which is that the STC recently took over quite a number of places within the country, in part because the STC was not invited to the peace negotiations or the ceasefire negotiations with the UN that were taking place in recent weeks. Again, here you have a situation in which Yemen is both a proxy conflict between Saudi Arabia and UAE. It has Iranian connections. It is, of course, being promoted as a place where there's been a tremendous amount of support for the Palestinian and the Hamas groups. So it effectively has so many different avenues in which it can make trouble, especially in 2026. And the Houthis love a bit of trouble, right? They think to themselves, the more trouble, the better. And they like to stay in the news, and they like to stay as like, I always say, like a mosquito, that on international politics. They're very effective in their ability to do that.
Just as we wrap, sort of stepping back, the data and I think the feeling of the average person on the ground, the world is getting bloodier. It's getting more dangerous. There is more hot conflict, as you say, more state actors involved than ever. Is this becoming the new normal?
It is 100% becoming the new normal. And I would be extremely surprised if 2026 did not see an increase in conflict. So I personally am expecting quite a lot of activity, as I mentioned earlier, around Venezuela and also around Iran, because neither of those conflicts show any sign of dissipating. They certainly show an indication that global politics is changing to the degree that interested parties, as I mentioned, the US, Russia, Israel, UAE, are taking a much more active role in changing the map of authority and conflict to their liking than they would have done in the past. I think this year was the first year we really saw the results of increased defense spending and a total change in how even the Western countries are prioritizing their domestic interests and their international interests over humanitarianism, human rights, peace building, mediation. And that shows no sign of stopping.
That was Clionadh Raleigh, CEO of the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Organisation known as ACLED. And we'll link to that report in the show notes. That's all for today's episode, but before we go, I want to read you a quick email from Richard. I really enjoyed Dom's interview with Al Khan's. The minister is no doubt a very impressive person and working very well in the areas he obviously knows well. But from experience, I fear for ministers parachuted straight into government. I hope I'm wrong, but I fear he will soon start to hit the reality of politics when he moves beyond his comfort zone and butts up against the ideals of his fellow Labour MPs and especially the membership. Keep up the excellent work. I've recommended the podcast to several acquaintances this week. Thank you so much for that email, Richard. We really appreciate your feedback. And of course, we appreciate you sharing this podcast via word of mouth. That's all for today's episode. We'll be back again on Wednesday with the Global Health Security Edition. Until then, goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles and hosted by me, Venetia Rainey, and Roland Oliphant. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it really helps others find the show. To stay on top of all of our news, subscribe to The Telegraph, sign up to our Dispatches newsletter, or listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. You can get in touch directly by emailing battlelines@telegraph.co.uk or contact us on X. You can find our handles in the show notes. The producer is Peter Shevlin. The executive producer is Louisa Wells.